Welcome back to Introduction to Fine Arts. This is Lecture 12, Byzantium and Islam. Another disclaimer, like our last one, some of our discussion today will once again center around closely held religious beliefs. Byzantium, same in some ways, but distinct from what we call Rome. But this culture always saw itself as a continuation of the Roman Empire, hence where the country of Romania in Eastern Europe gets its name. The Byzantine label was a product of Western European historians in the 1800s to reinforce an us versus them mentality that by then had been clobbered into the populations of each area. Some of the events of this time period set the stage for an animosity that lingers even today. Basically, this term designates the Greek-speaking Romans from the Latin-speaking ones. It's sort of confusing. So when does it start? There's no clear beginning. Maybe when Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople, the distance created diverging church traditions to the point that it becomes, for all intents and purposes, a separate religion. Maybe the switch of the official language from Latin to Greek. The ancient cultures often seem to be caught up in language. But the death of Theodosius in 395 is a pretty good starting point. 527 begins the reign of Justinian, the first great Byzantine emperor. So that's also a good start date. How about the end? It happened slowly as the empire lost more and more land and power until it was more like a city-state. 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Turks is the last possible endpoint to the Byzantine Empire. In that 1,000-year period, Western Europe had endured the sacking of Rome, the Dark Ages, all sorts of feudal fits and starts, and finally was solidly in the Renaissance. But the Byzantine Empire was there the whole time, the Romans in the East. In essence, the Byzantine Empire was the Rome that withstood the barbarian onslaught and far outlasted the Western Empire. The purple is the territory conquered by Justinian. So you can see that their rule wasn't actually confined to the eastern region. They were preservers of classical culture, and this played a big role in the Renaissance later on. They were the successors to Rome in all its glory. Their art was deeply influenced by Eastern sensibilities. It was decorative, flat, it was colorful, kind of flashy, and as you can see, they interacted with the West. At times, its empire extended all the way to Italy and further. By then, the Italian peninsula wasn't even part of the Western Roman Empire anymore. And the Byzantine culture influenced a lot of art styles in the West as well. In the Byzantine Empire, politics and religion were one. The church was the state. Unlike what was typical in the West, there was no separation. The emperor was the head of the church and held absolute power. And here is Justinian. He brought the Eastern Empire to immense power and influence and tried to reestablish the full Roman Empire, the unification of the East and the West. And he won a lot of territory in the West, especially Italy, as we've talked about. On top of all that he was responsible for was the construction of the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of the Holy Wisdom. The previous church at this location had burnt down in riots. This is quite possibly the greatest church ever built. It's a fusion of the best of Christian and classical ideals. The relatively plain and stoic exterior gives way to an absolutely magnificent interior. It was bathed in light from all sides. The dome seemed suspended from the heavens as if resting on air. It was 50 meters high. The Hagia Sophia was damaged and repaired many times, changed to a Catholic church during the Crusades, then back to Orthodox, then taken over by the Muslims and became a mosque, then because of its cultural heritage was converted to a museum in the 20th century. Very recently, as in the summer of 2020, It was converted back to a mosque again by the Turkish president in a controversial move meant to shore up political support from that country's version of the religious right. There are a couple interesting videos about this amazing structure posted in the module that I encourage you to check out. Moving to the Italian region of the Byzantine Empire, this is San Vitale in Ravenna. It was a domed church and reflected a Platonic influence in that it was circular rather than rectangular. And by Platonic, I mean the influence of Plato, the philosopher. Here you see the arching interior filled with mosaics. The imagery in these mosaics featured flat, decorative depictions. The Byzantine people were the preservers of classical ideas, but not necessarily classical style. In fact, with them, the transition away from the classical style is basically complete. In fact, the Justinian mosaic here has a complete lack of spatial accuracy, very stylized imagery, and perhaps most of all, the prominence of narrative over naturalism. The mosaics here are bright and colorful, they're dazzling, which is really part of the point. Here's where we see a conscientious shift toward abstraction in order to convey a reality that the Byzantine Orthodox Christians saw as a higher reality, the spiritual realm. In all three major Western religious traditions, there is a belief, influenced by the Greek philosopher Plato, that the physical world we live in is sort of debased. It's temporary, it's imperfect, and never can be perfect. But the spiritual realm is where perfection can lie. It's like the body-soul dichotomy that is such an integral part of these religions, particularly Christianity and Islam. The imagery in these mosaics aren't meant to look real in the material sense of the word. They weren't meant to accurately convey what the scene would look like. They were meant to elevate metaphysical reality over physical reality. The flattened figures, no chiaroscuro, no convincing ground for them to stand on. They seem to float in the air inside a kind of aura. These are spiritual figures. Of course, this dovetails nicely with the need to depict the complete authority of the emperor. As we said, there was no separation between church and state. They were one and the same. Across from the Justinian mosaic is the Theodora mosaic. Empress Theodora. Her life would make a great movie, except there are widely varied accounts of who she really was. She had been an actress, only slightly one rung removed from a prostitute in Byzantine culture. So even the fact that she could become an empress was unheard of. Justinian literally had to change the law in order to marry her. And she became, in many ways, his partner, maybe similar to Akhenaten and Nefertiti in the relationship they had. She famously saved the day during the Nika riots. Justinian and his aides were about to flee, and she gave an impassioned speech convincing them not to escape but to stay and fight. They stayed and defeated the rioters, which meant killing over 30,000 people, but anyway. And this sort of brings us to an important cultural development within Christianity, the monastic movement. This was an influential development in all of Christendom, not just the Byzantine culture. Originally, Christian monks were mostly desert hermits, withdrawn from society. Picture Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars. They practiced asceticism and were striving for union with God. An ascetic is not the same as aesthetic. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. It represents, whereas aesthetic is like pleasure, sensual pleasure, ascetic represents the abstinence from all worldly pleasures. Many religious traditions have their equivalent. The Christian version becomes very popular. It begins a bit earlier than this, around the 200s in Egypt, but it spreads all the way to Ireland, in fact, which really did feel like the edge of the world. Even though this movement began informally, by the 5th century it was regulated, codified even. Now there was a right way to be a monk. Why this change? Well, the loss of tax revenue is one reason. These weirdos wandering around in the desert aren't exactly productive members of society. Plus, there were certain control issues amongst the powerful in Constantinople and all over the Christian world. All these people going off on their own meant the church couldn't dictate their actions. Who knows what those hippies are doing out there in the wilderness? So monasteries were established. This was the perfect vehicle for wealth creation. Monks performed free labor for the church, lots of free labor, in fact. And over time, this radically increased the power of the church. It also created a class of literate people. One of their main functions was to copy texts, especially the Bible, and decorate books through manuscript illumination, which we'll revisit in the next chapter. But three of the most significant events surrounding the Byzantine Empire are iconoclasm, the Great Schism, and the Crusades. We're going to touch on all three. First, iconoclasm. The use of icons, or religious images like portable paintings or mosaics of saints, Jesus, God, etc., became an important part of Christian worship. Among other things, they were used to illustrate religious concepts, especially for people who couldn't read. But more importantly, particularly in Byzantine culture, they were the objects of veneration, spiritual tools that allowed a true communion with God. So, what's the problem? Well, there's this little passage in the Ten Commandments. You shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above or in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. Making pictures has been a part of human culture since before there even was organized religion. So people, the Christians in this case, rationalized their way around it from the get-go. Lots of, yeah, I know it says that, but we really like our pictures. And everything seemed to be working out fine until the late 720s, when there appeared a sign from God in the form of a massive volcanic eruption that killed a lot of people, followed by a bunch of barbarians threatening the very existence of New Rome. This got the emperor thinking. Emperor Leo III said these unfortunate events were God's punishment for people using images in their worship. Around 730, he started the iconoclasm movement, the destruction of religious images. His supporters broke into any place with art in it and defaced or destroyed every religious picture they could find. But a lot of people loved their pictures, so not everyone went along with it. It was very much like a witch hunt mentality, and it became a pitched political battle. And this attitude came and went for around 100 years. As a consequence, most early Byzantine art is lost to us. Eventually, image making gained widespread acceptance again. By 843, it was officially okay to make pictures. Emperor Basil I refurbished churches, mostly Byzantine, or rather most of the Byzantine art remaining to this day is from after that date. Next is the Great Schism of 1054. This was a formal division of the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox traditions. It arose out of a disagreement over papal authority in the eastern portion of Christendom. As significant as this is, they were already on a different path by then anyway, and this just sort of puts the divorce in writing. The lasting impact is hard to overstate, though. The effects of this split are felt to this day. But the Crusades are possibly the most notable of these events. It's still a very touchy subject. The Crusades were a series of religious wars by the Western European Christians against the Muslims who occupied the Holy Lands. They all started when the Byzantines asked for help from the West against the invading Muslims. Can you help a poor Christian brother out? These infidel Muslims are killing us. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II declared the First Crusade. To do so, he capitalized on religious fervor in the West at the time. One could become a soldier of God and gain indulgences or remission of their sins for their sacrifice. But the armies that went out weren't really a unified force, and a lot of them followed their own set of rules, and they were not always as righteous as their name would suggest. Many of them were distrustful of Orthodox Christians. This was after the schism, and they encountered a lot of suspicious Jews along the way as well. Remember, Western Europe was a cultural backwater at this point. They didn't get out much and were xenophobic to the extreme. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, an army passes by and sees how splendid the Eastern Christians seem to have it. So they invade Constantinople instead of invading the Muslims. They totally looted the city and destroyed everything they could in what can only be described as a jealous rage. Why did this happen? There was a complex political situation at the time, and there was the blinding religious fanaticism of the Crusaders. Remember, Orthodox Christianity wasn't true Christianity to them. And there certainly was an element of jealousy. By then, the Byzantine culture was way more wealthy and civilized than Western Europe was. The majesty of the architecture and mosaics and libraries. You might remember in the West, the empire had been gone for 700 years, and they were still pretty much in the Dark Ages. Here was a majestic city beyond anything they had seen in scale and beauty. Why do these guys get to have such nice stuff and not us? They might have thought. The outcome? Well, whatever chance of a reunion there might have been between East and West was gone now. To the people of Constantinople, the accursed Latins were worse than the Muslim invaders they asked for protection from. The Crusades affected both the East and the West. For the East, it turned out to be a fatal blow. The Byzantine Empire never really recovered. It dwindled gradually for the next 250 years and eventually ended. But animosity between these two Christian cultures was there for good. In many ways, even the Cold War of the 20th century is a great example of this lingering distrust. And so, here's the Byzantine Empire at its height. And here it is in 1450, as it struggles to hang on as the Islamic world closes in from all sides. In 1453, the light of New Rome was officially snuffed out. By any conceivable measure, this is the end of the Roman Empire. Ottoman Turks take over Constantinople. They turn the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Christian artists and intellectuals flee to the West, bringing the remnants of classical knowledge with them. Actually, they had been fleeing for quite a while, as the Byzantine Empire lost more and more. The most likely destination? Italy. In a lot of respects, their emigration brings the Renaissance to the West. Next, let's talk about the religious culture that supplanted the Christian Byzantine Empire, Islam. The central figure of Islam is Muhammad. He is seen as the last in a whole line of prophets, including Moses and Jesus. It's a completion of the monotheistic Judeo-Christian tradition, like a software update. Abrahamic monotheism 3.0. The same God, same creation mythology, same basic moral structure. But the whole thing is simplified. There's no priesthood or hierarchical bureaucratic power structure. There's no arcane, ritualistic, liturgical requirements, and they had a straightforward message, in stark contrast to the 7th century Christianity, which had become incredibly complicated and hard to understand. In Islam, it was simple. Everyone was judged equally before God. You just have to follow the 5 pillars. 1, your profession of faith. Number 2, you have to pray 5 times a day, facing Mecca. Number 3, you have to give charity to the poor. Number 4, you've got to fast in daylight hours during Ramadan, the Islamic holy month. And finally, number 5, you have to at least try to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life. Pretty simple. And here's the story in a nutshell, of course. In the year 610, Muhammad hears voices and sees visions from God. His visions are collected into the Quran, or Book of Recitations. He gathers followers. This arouses hostility and persecution from the power structure in Mecca. He challenged their gods, their loose morals, and their social inequalities. Sound familiar? But he took it too far when he condemned a powerful local cult, which threatened the lucrative pilgrimage trade, and that wouldn't do at all. The government tried to silence him with bribes and ostracism, and even threatened his life. So he fled Mecca. But instead of turning the other cheek, he comes back a few years later with an army and conquers Mecca, or, well, converts Mecca. Those are sort of the same thing. Muslims go on to conquer huge amounts of territory and convert massive amounts of people. Like in early Christianity, the message was appealing to marginalized people everywhere. And unlike Christianity at that time, and a lot of times, the Muslim world was quite tolerant of science and arts and even other people's religious beliefs, compared to their Christian contemporaries at least. Just a few of the great contributions made by the Muslim world include mathematics, especially algebra, and astronomy. They also translated and preserved many classical works at a time when the Western Christians were banning them. Regarding the Islamic art tradition, they used mostly non-objective imagery. They had a similar reticence to depict religious figures as the Byzantine Christians did. Calligraphy was an important part of their artistic output. There were also decorative mosaics, and they particularly excelled in architecture. This is an interior shot of the Great Mosque at Cordoba. This is in Spain. The Muslims got all the way into Western Europe at one point, and it's famous for its striped arches, like billowing candy-striped clouds. But perhaps the most iconic example of Muslim architecture is the Dome of the Rock. It's located on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is a controversial location to say the least. It's a holy site for each of the big three Western religious traditions, and it's got a whole lot of religious significance. According to legend, perhaps Adam's gravesite, or maybe the location of the sacrifice of Isaac and the Temple of Solomon. And for Muslims specifically, this is the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's a focal point of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that exists to this day. It's a domed octagon, kind of like San Vitale. And it features a vivid, ornate colored tile pattern. It's truly dazzling to look at. All right. Next, we'll turn our attention back to the West, and we'll see what happens there while the Byzantine and Islamic stuff was going down in the East. It's a very different sort of story. Until then, farewell.